The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Duke Gaius Caesar of Estries knelt before his wife's grave, a silver locket trembling in his fingers. He came every year on this date. He came alone. He came to remember. But this year, someone was waiting for him. A small hand touched his shoulder. He turned, expecting a groundskeeper, expecting nothing at all, and found a little girl staring at him with eyes that held no business being so old. "Your Grace," she whispered, "your daughter never died." The locket slipped from his fingers and struck the wet stone with a sound like a bell tolling backward through time. Because Gaius Caesar's daughter had been buried 8 years ago, he had watched them lower the tiny casket himself. So what, was standing in front of him now? Before the Duke even rises from that grave, I need you to do one thing. Press subscribe right now, because what this child says next will unravel a lie that's been buried longer than that little casket. You do not want to miss this. Also, if you're the type of person who reads the last page of a mystery novel first, do not do that here. There is no last page. This is YouTube. Subscribe, or you'll be left standing in a graveyard like the Duke, confused and rained on. Let's begin. Estries was a name spoken with reverence across the kingdom, an estate of marble halls, endless vineyards, and a bloodline so old it predated the crown itself. Duke Gaius Caesar had inherited all of it at the age of 26, after the sudden death of his father, and had spent the 11 years since trying to be worthy of it. He had married Cassia, a woman of quiet brilliance and quieter sorrow, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family from the southern ports. Their marriage had scandalized half the nobility and delighted the other half, who whispered that the Duke of Estries had finally done something interesting. Together, Gaius and Cassia had a daughter, a girl with her mother's dark curls and her father's stubborn chin, a girl who laughed too loud at dinner and refused to wear shoes even in winter. Her name was Amelia. Her name was never spoken anymore, not by the staff, not by Gaius, not even, he suspected, by God. 3 years after their daughter's death, Cassia herself had passed. Of grief, the physician said, though grief was never written on a death certificate. She had simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped looking out the window at the gardens where her daughter used to play. Gaius buried her beside their child and locked the nursery door. He had not opened it since. For 8 years, the Duke had visited this graveyard on the anniversary of his daughter's death, carrying the same locket, a gift he'd given Cassia on their wedding day, later buried with their daughter's small portrait sealed inside, a final piece of the family that had been ripped from him. He had become, in those 8 years, a different man. Where once he had been known for his warmth, for inviting tenant farmers to dine at his table, for laughing too easily, for dancing with his wife in the empty ballroom just because the music sounded nice, he was now known for silence, for long absences in his study, for the way he flinched whenever a child's laughter echoed through the halls of Estries Manor, which was rare because there were no children at Estries anymore, except tonight the locket was in his hand, not in the ground. Tonight, a stranger's child stood over 2 graves that weren't supposed to concern her, holding a truth that would burn the house of Estries to its foundations. And somewhere, in a locked study 3 miles away, a man who had spent 11 years believing himself safe was about to discover that the past does not stay buried, not even when you bury it twice. Her name was Albina, and she could not have been older than 9. She wore a coat too thin for the cold, gray wool, patched at the elbows, clearly a hand-me-down from someone twice her size. Her boots were caked in mud from the long walk to the graveyard, and her dark curls were plastered to her forehead by the rain. But none of that was what struck Gaius first. What struck him was her stillness. Children, in his experience, what little experience he had left, were creatures of motion. They fidgeted, they glanced away, they betrayed themselves with nervous energy even when they were trying to be brave. This child did none of that. She stood with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head, who had walked toward this exact conversation across miles of cold road, and who was not about to let nerves undo what she had come to do. "Who sent you?" Gaius demanded, rising to his feet, rainwater dripping from his coat onto the gravestone below. "Who told you to say that?" "Nobody sent me," Albina said. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, the voice of someone delivering bad news to a person they did not want to hurt. "I came on my own. I've been waiting for you to come here for almost a year." "A year?" Gaius's laugh was hollow, more breath than sound. "You've been waiting? For a duke you've never met? At the grave of a child you couldn't possibly have known? You come every year, same day, same flowers." Albina nodded toward the white roses wilting at the base of the headstone, their petals already curling brown at the edges from days of rain. "White roses, 6 of them, always 6. I've watched you place them here for the last 3 years, ever since I was old enough to walk this far without anyone noticing I was gone." Gaius felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the rain. "You've been watching me. I needed to be sure it was really you before I said anything," Albina said. "Trax, the woman who raised me. She told me a duke would come here every year, grieving a daughter. She said his name was Gaius Caesar, and she described him to me. Dark hair, tall, a scar above his left eyebrow from a riding accident when he was young." Gaius's hand rose unconsciously to the thin white scar above his eyebrow, a mark from a fall off a horse when he was 14, a mark so old and so faint that even his own staff rarely noticed it. "How?" he said slowly. "Would a woman in some village know a detail like that?" "Because she used to work here," Albina said. "Years ago. Before any of this. Before me." Gaius stared at her, rain running down his face, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The graveyard around them was empty except for the 2 of them, and the rows of weathered headstones stretching back toward the iron gate, fog curling between them like something alive. "My daughter is dead, child," Gaius said finally, though the words came out less certain than he intended. "I buried her myself. I do not know what cruel joke someone has put you up to, or what they hope to gain by sending a child to torment a grieving father, but I—" "Open it," Albina interrupted. "What?" "The locket, the one you dropped." She gestured to where it lay on the wet stone, half sunk into a puddle. "Open it. Tell me whose picture is inside." Gaius's jaw tightened, but something in her certainty, something in the absolute calm with which she made the request, as though she already knew the answer and was simply waiting for him to catch up, made his fingers move against his will. He bent, retrieved the locket, wiped the rain from its surface with his thumb. The clasp clicked open. Inside, behind a thin pane of glass that had somehow survived 8 years of being opened and closed on this exact spot once a year, was a miniature portrait, his daughter at 2 years old, painted by a court artist mere months before she died. Dark curls, a round, laughing face, a blue dress. "There," he said, voice rough, holding it toward her as though to prove a point to himself as much as to her. "My daughter, painted before her death. This is all that remains of her, except for a grave that has not been disturbed in 8 years. What was she wearing in that painting? A blue dress with—" Gaius stopped. His blood went cold, draining from his face so fast he felt momentarily dizzy. "How would you know to ask that?" Albina reached into the collar of her thin coat and pulled out a thread, a faded scrap of blue fabric embroidered with tiny silver stars, tied around her neck like a talisman, worn soft and thin from years of handling. "Because I have the dress," she said, "or what's left of it. The woman who raised me said it was the only thing I had when she found me, wrapped around me like a blanket, even though I was barely 6 months old, and the dress was clearly meant for a toddler, not a baby. She said it didn't make sense, but she kept it anyway, because it seemed important. She said a lady gave me to her in the night, crying, begging her to keep me safe and never tell anyone where I came from." The rain seemed to grow louder in Gaius's ears, or perhaps it was his own pulse, hammering against his skull. "That woman," Albina continued, her voice softening slightly, The first crack of emotion Gaius had seen in her. Died last winter. Of the lung sickness. Before she did, she told me everything she knew. She told me my real name wasn't Albina. That was just what she called me, after her own mother. She told me I had another name, a title even. She made me promise on her deathbed that I would find you, that I would tell you the truth no matter how long it took or how far I had to walk. What name? Gaius's voice was barely a whisper now, and his hand, the hand holding the locket, had begun to shake. Albina looked at him, really looked, the way a person looks when they've rehearsed a moment 1,000 times and finally arrived at it and find that all the rehearsal in the world cannot prepare you for how it actually feels. She said my name was Amelia Caesar, Albina said, daughter of the Duke of Estrées. For a long moment, Gaius Caesar did not move. He stood in the rain, in the graveyard, holding a locket containing the portrait of a dead daughter, looking at a living girl who claimed to be that exact daughter, and felt the entire architecture of his grief, 8 years of carefully constructed, carefully maintained grief, begin, quietly, to crumble. That is not possible, he said. But even as he said it, he heard how weak the words sounded. I know it sounds impossible, Albina said. I know. I've had 9 years to think about how impossible it sounds, and I still don't fully understand it myself. But, Your Grace, I walked 11 miles in the rain to find you here, because I didn't know where else to go, and because Trax told me, with her dying breath, that somewhere out there was a man who never stopped grieving for me. I came because I thought you deserved to know that the grief wasn't necessary. Not anymore. Gaius looked down at the locket in his hand, then up at the girl in front of him, at the dark curls plastered with rain that were so similar to a portrait he had carried for 8 years that it made his chest ache, at the round face, at the stubborn set of her jaw which he recognized with a jolt because he saw it every morning in the mirror. Come inside, he said finally, his voice cracking on the words. Out of the rain, we have a great deal to discuss. Gaius did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, a vast room lined with leather-bound books that he rarely read anymore, dominated by a portrait of his late wife that he had never been able to bring himself to remove, with Albina across from him. She was wrapped in a blanket, given hot soup and bread by a housekeeper named Nessa, who had taken one look at the soaked, shivering child, and immediately set about feeding her without asking a single question, because that was simply the kind of woman Nessa was. Gaius watched the girl eat, watched the careful, almost disbelieving way she handled the bread, as though she expected someone to take it from her at any moment, and felt something twist painfully in his chest. If you are lying to me, he said quietly, once she had finished, I will have you returned to wherever you came from, and I will forget this night ever happened. I will not punish you for it. I understand that children can be used by adults with cruel intentions. But I need you to understand the gravity of what you are claiming. I know, Albina said, setting down the bowl with careful precision. But I'm not lying. And I think you already suspect I'm not. I saw it on your face, in the graveyard. Before I even said my name, something in you already knew something was wrong, didn't it? She was right, and it terrified him, because she had named something he had never said aloud to a single living soul, something he had buried as deeply as his grief, deeper even than the empty space where his daughter's name used to live. Gaius rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the dark gardens, rain still falling steadily against the glass. The day of my daughter's funeral, he said, his back to her. The casket had already been sealed before I arrived at the chapel. My stepmother, Sophia Boyle, had insisted on it. She said it was for my own peace, so that I wouldn't have to see the child in such a state after the fever had run its course. I was not in a condition to argue. I had not slept in 3 days. My wife had collapsed twice from grief and exhaustion. I simply agreed. I let them seal it before I could see her one last time. He paused, his hand resting against the cold glass of the window. But I remember carrying that casket to the family crypt myself, alongside my brother Calix. We were the ones who carried it down those stone steps, into the dark, and placed it in the alcove beside where my mother and father rest. And I remember... His voice broke just slightly, and he pressed his palm flat against the window as though to steady himself. I remember that it was light, too light. A child's casket should not feel like carrying an empty box, but it did. I told myself it was because the dead weigh less than the living somehow, that grief was playing tricks on my senses, that I was not in my right mind and could not trust anything my body told me in that moment. I buried that thought along with my daughter, and I never spoke of it again. Not to Cassia, not to anyone. For 8 years, I told myself it was nothing. A trick of grief, a trick of memory. He turned back to face Albina, and in the firelight his eyes were wet. Now I sit here, looking at a girl with my late wife's dimples and my own scar above her eyebrow, and that thought has clawed its way back to the surface, and I do not know what to do with it. Albina was quiet for a moment, watching him with an expression far too old for her face. "There's something else," she said finally. "The woman who raised me, Trax, she kept a letter from the lady who gave me to her. I memorized it years ago because Trax made me promise never to lose the original, no matter what. And then, we lost everything in a fire 2 winters ago. The cottage, all our belongings, everything. The letter burned with it. But I remember every word. I've said it to myself every night since, so I would never forget." "Recite it," Gaius said, his voice barely above a whisper. Albina closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice took on a different cadence, not a child's voice anymore, but the careful, frightened cadence of someone repeating words that had been spoken to save a life, words she had clearly heard described many times, even if she had never seen the letter herself. "Keep her safe, keep her hidden. Tell no one her name, not even her own, if you can help it. Give her another. If anyone asks, she is an orphan with no family, found abandoned, nothing more. The Duke must never know, not yet, not until it is safe for both of them. There are people in that house who would rather a dead child than a living heir. Do not trust anyone who comes asking questions. Do not trust kindness from strangers. If they find her, they will not be gentle about it." The fire in the study crackled and popped, throwing shifting shadows across the walls. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, and an unnatural silence settled over Estrie's manor, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. "There are people in that house," Gaius repeated slowly, each word feeling like a stone dropping into still water, "who would rather be a dead child than a living heir." He looked up at Albina. At Amelia, he corrected himself, though the name still felt strange and miraculous on his tongue, and for the first time in 8 years, something other than grief moved through his chest. It rose up from somewhere deep and old, somewhere he had thought long since extinguished. It was rage. "Who else lived in this house 8 years ago, Amelia?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who else had access to that crypt? Who else benefited from my daughter never growing old enough to inherit?" Albina did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the small bundle of belongings she had carried with her, a worn cloth sack containing everything she owned in the world, and withdrew a small, tarnished object wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth. "There's one more thing," she said, unwrapping it slowly. "Trax said I should only show this to you if you believed me. If you didn't believe me, she said to keep it hidden, because it might be dangerous." She placed the object on the table between them. It was a bracelet, small, child-sized, made of delicate gold links with a tiny enameled crest at its center. Gaius recognized the crest instantly. It was the Estries family seal, the same seal that adorned the gates of the manor, the same seal stamped into the wax of every official document the family had produced for 400 years. "This was given to every Estries child at birth," Gaius said, his hands trembling as he picked it up. "It's a tradition. My father gave one to me. I gave one to—" He stopped. "I gave one to my daughter," he finished, The week she was born. It was placed on her wrist, and it was never removed, not once, in 2 years. It was meant to grow with her, to be resized as she aged, a mark of her place in this family that she would wear her entire life. He turned the bracelet over in his hands, and there, on the inside of the smallest link, barely visible, was an engraving. A single letter A, followed by a date, the date of his daughter's birth. "This cannot be a copy," Gaius said, his voice unsteady. "These were made individually, by a single jeweler in the capital, using a process my family has kept secret for generations. No one outside this family could replicate this engraving. No one." "Then you believe me," Albina said. It wasn't quite a question. Gaius looked up from the bracelet into the eyes of a girl who shared his late wife's face and his own stubborn jaw, and felt 8 years of carefully maintained grief finally, completely collapse. "God help me," he whispered. "I believe you." Sophia Boyle had run the Estries household since Gaius's father's death 12 years ago, a widow herself, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who managed every detail of a great house while ensuring no one ever noticed her doing it. She had been, in many ways, the closest thing to a mother Gaius had after his own mother's early death, and he had trusted her implicitly for most of his life. Gaius found her in the east drawing room the next morning, embroidering by the window in the pale gray light, as though the world had not just tilted on its axis overnight. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression must have told her immediately that this was not a casual visit, because her needle paused mid-stitch. "You look unwell, Gaius," she said carefully. "Did you not sleep?" 8 years ago, Gaius said, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet, "you arranged my daughter's funeral, every detail. The chapel, the procession, the burial. You handled all of it because Kasia and I were too broken to manage it ourselves." "A terrible time," Sophia said slowly, setting down her embroidery. "For all of us. I did what I could to spare you both additional pain. You insisted the casket be sealed before I arrived at the chapel." Sophia's hands folded in her lap, very still. "You were not in a state to view. The casket was empty, wasn't it?" The room went silent. The fire crackled. Outside, a servant's footsteps echoed down a distant corridor and then faded into nothing. For a long moment, Sophia Boyle said nothing at all. She simply looked at Gaius, and something shifted behind her composed features. Not surprise, he realized with a jolt, but something closer to relief, as though a weight she had carried for 8 years was finally, mercifully, being set down. "She found you then," Sophia said quietly. "The girl. Albina." The name, not Emilia, but Albina, confirmed everything. Sophia knew. Sophia had always known. "You knew," Gaius said, his voice flat with disbelief. "All this time, every year when I came to you, weeping over my daughter's grave, you knew she was alive." "I have always known," Sophia said, rising slowly from her chair and crossing to the window, her back to him. "Gaius, I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear all of it before you judge me, because what I did, and what I did not do, saved that child's life, even if it also condemned you to 8 years of unnecessary grief. I have struggled with that trade every single day since." "Then explain it to me," Gaius said, his voice tight with the effort of controlling his anger. "Explain to me how my daughter ended up alive in some village cottage while I buried sandbags and watched my wife waste away from grief over a death that never happened." Sophia turned to face him. Her eyes, usually so composed, were bright with something that might have been tears. "Your daughter did not die of fever," she said. "She was never sick at all. There was a conspiracy, not mine, Gaius. I want you to understand that from the start, to remove her from the line of succession before she could grow old enough to inherit, before her bloodline could be diluted, as certain people in this family chose to call it, by your wife's family. Diluted." The word came out of Gaius like a curse. Cassia's family were merchants, successful, respected merchants, but not nobility, no. Is that the crime my daughter was condemned for? The crime of being born to a mother who wasn't born with a title? The Estrées bloodline, Sophia said, her voice heavy, has never in 400 years married outside the established nobility. Not once in 14 generations. There were those, powerful people, people with influence in the capital, people connected to old families who had spent centuries maintaining their own bloodlines, who believed your marriage to Casia was already an unforgivable stain on the Estrées name, a scandal that would be whispered about for generations. And a daughter from that union, Gaius said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in his mind with horrible clarity. Raised to inherit the dukedom, to one day hold the title, to one day marry into other noble houses, carrying that tainted blood with her, was, to certain people, unacceptable, Sophia finished quietly. Who? Gaius's hand closed into a fist at his side. Who decided my child's life was unacceptable, Sophia? Who had the authority to make that decision and who carried it out? Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and Gaius watched fear flicker across her face. Real fear, the kind that comes from finally speaking words you've kept locked away for years because you knew, the moment you said them, your life would change irrevocably. Your brother, she said finally. Calix made the arrangements. He worked with the household physician, paid him a substantial sum to falsify the cause of death, and he worked with a man named Scipio, your father's former steward, to ensure the child was removed quietly. I only learned of the plan 2 days before it was meant to be carried out. By then, it was already in motion. I could not stop it entirely, but I could change it. Change it how? The original plan, Sophia said, and her voice dropped even further, was not for the child to be hidden, Gaius. It was for the child to be gone. Permanently. Scipio was meant to ensure there would be no daughter left to ever come forward, no matter how many years passed. The words settled over the room like a shroud. Gaius felt the blood drain from his face. You're telling me, he said slowly, that my brother ordered my infant daughter, a 2-year-old child, to be killed. I am telling you, Sophia said, that I intervened before that could happen. I went to Scipio myself, the night before it was meant to occur, and I do not know what I said to him exactly. I have never fully understood why he agreed. Perhaps he had limits. Even he was unwilling to cross. Perhaps it was something else entirely. But he agreed to a different arrangement, one that would satisfy Calix's demand that the child disappear, without requiring Scipio to do the thing he had been hired to do. The child would be given to a family far away, told to raise her as their own, with no connection to Estrées ever revealed. Calix would believe the matter handled. The household would believe the child had died of fever. And somewhere, far from here, a little girl would grow up safe, even if she never knew who she truly was. And you let me believe she was dead, Gaius said, his voice rising for the first time, 8 years of carefully buried grief finally breaking the surface as rage. You let me bury an empty casket. You let me grieve for 8 years. You let Casia die of that grief, Sophia. My wife wasted away believing our daughter was dead, and you knew the entire time that she wasn't. I know, Sophia said, and now there were tears on her face openly. I have asked myself every single day for 8 years whether I made the right choice, whether I should have told you, regardless of the risk. But Gaius, if I had told you, and you had reacted the way any father would react, with outrage, with demands for justice, Calix would have known immediately that his plan had been altered. He would have sent Scipio to finish what he originally intended. The only thing protecting that child for 8 years was that everyone, including you, believed she was already dead. The moment that belief was disturbed, her life would have been in danger again. Gaius stood frozen, the weight of 11 years crashing down at once, the empty casket, the locket, the grief, Casia's slow decline, all of it built on a lie designed by his own brother to erase his daughter from existence entirely. His brother, his own blood, had ordered his child's death, and when that order had been quietly subverted, had spent 8 years believing it had succeeded, while Gaius buried an empty box and his wife died of grief for a daughter who was alive. "Where is Calix now?" Gaius asked, his voice unnervingly calm, the calm of a man who has gone past anger into something colder and far more dangerous. Sophia hesitated, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "He arrives tomorrow, for the quarterly estate review. He insists on conducting it personally every season, though I've always suspected it has more to do with reminding the staff of his presence than any genuine interest in the accounts. He doesn't know the girl has resurfaced. Trax was supposed to keep her hidden indefinitely, certainly until she came of age, and even then, only if it became absolutely necessary would anyone consider quietly removing her if she ever became, in Calix's words, a problem. "A problem," Gaius repeated, the word tasting like poison. "Gaius." Sophia's voice dropped, urgent now. "If Calix learns Emilia is alive and in this house before you're prepared for that confrontation, he will not hesitate a second time. Whatever limits stopped Scipio 8 years ago, I do not believe they will hold a second time, not with Calix's own position and inheritance now directly threatened by her existence. He will finish what he started 8 years ago, and this time I will not be able to stop him." Gaius looked toward the window, toward the gardens where, 8 years ago, his daughter used to play, and where now, somewhere in the manor, that same daughter sat in a borrowed dress, eating breakfast, utterly unaware that the man arriving tomorrow had once ordered her death. "Then we have until tomorrow," Gaius said quietly, "to decide how this confrontation will go. And Sophia, I want you to understand something. What you did was not enough. It was not right. 8 years of lies cannot be undone with an explanation, however well-intentioned. But it was also, perhaps, the only thing that kept my daughter alive. I do not forgive you. Not yet. But I am not finished with this conversation either." "I understand," Sophia said quietly. "I have waited 8 years for this conversation, Gaius. I am only grateful it is finally happening." Calix Caesar arrived at Estrees Manor exactly as he always did, with 3 carriages, a retinue of attendants, and the easy arrogance of a man who had spent his life as the second son and resented every moment of it. He was 4 years younger than Gaius, sharper featured, with their father's cold gray eyes and none of their mother's warmth. Where Gaius had inherited the title through nothing more than the accident of birth order, Calix had spent a lifetime believing he deserved it more, that he was the more capable administrator, the more politically astute negotiator, the more fit heir, denied only by the cruel arbitrariness of having been born second. For 11 years, he had watched his older brother hold the title he believed should have been his. For 8 of those years, he had believed his patience was finally paying off, that with no surviving heir, the dukedom would, upon Gaius's eventual death, fall to him after all. He had no idea, as his carriage rolled through the gates of Estrees, that the foundation of that belief had crumbled overnight. "Brother," Calix greeted, sweeping into the great hall with theatrical warmth, removing his traveling gloves with practiced elegance. "You look terrible. Are you still moping about the anniversary?" "It's been 8 years, Gaius. At some point, grief becomes self-indulgence. You have an estate to run. Tenants depend on you. The dead do not." "Self-indulgence," Gaius repeated mildly, standing at the center of the great hall, his hands clasped behind his back. "Yes, I suppose burying an empty casket and grieving for 8 years over a living child would be quite self-indulgent of me." The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Calix's smile did not falter, not entirely, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way a predator goes still when it senses, too late, that it has walked into a trap. "I'm sorry," Calix said, his voice carefully light. "I don't follow." "My daughter," Gaius said, stepping closer, each word measured and deliberate, "is alive, Calix. She found me last night, at her own grave, standing over the spot where you and Sophia and a man named Scipio convinced everyone to bury an empty box, dressed in a christening gown, and call it a child's body. The great hall fell utterly silent. Servants who had been moving through the periphery of the room, polishing fixtures, carrying linens, froze in place, sensing, as servants always do, that something momentous was occurring. In the upper gallery, hidden behind a marble pillar, Albina watched, exactly as Gaius had instructed her to do, her small hands gripping the railing. Calix's composure cracked for half a second, just half a second, a flicker of something raw and panicked beneath the polished surface, before he laughed, sharp and dismissive, the laugh of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "This is absurd," he said. "Some street urchin appears at your wife's grave, spinning a story, and you, grief-stricken, sleep-deprived, exactly the kind of man who would be vulnerable to such a scheme. You simply believe her? Gaius, I love you, but this is exactly the kind of thing con artists prey upon. Desperate parents, old griefs, false hope." "I have the locket," Gaius said quietly, cutting through Calix's words like a blade. "The one buried with the empty casket. The one with our daughter's portrait inside, sealed there by the jeweler who painted it, never opened again after the funeral. Except that it was in my hand last night, Calix, not in the crypt where it was meant to remain forever. The one that should not exist outside that sealed casket unless someone removed it before sealing the coffin." He paused. "You sealed that coffin, Calix. You and Sophia, 8 years ago. Tell me, did you remove the locket yourself, or did you leave that detail to someone else?" Calix's jaw tightened. The mask was slipping now, the charming younger brother dissolving piece by piece into something colder and older, something that had been waiting 11 years for an accusation it had believed would never come. "You don't understand what's at stake, Gaius," Calix said, and his voice had changed entirely now, lower, harder, stripped of its earlier warmth. "This family, this name, it's older than the crown itself. 14 generations, Gaius. 14 generations of careful marriages, careful alliances, careful preservation of bloodline and reputation. And then you, our father's chosen heir, the one entrusted with carrying that legacy forward, you threw it away. You married a merchant's daughter, a commoner. You turned this family into a punchline at every dinner table in the capital." "Casia," Gaius said, his voice dropping dangerously, "was worth more than every titled woman in this kingdom combined. And our daughter—" "Your daughter," Calix interrupted, "was the proof. The living proof that the Estries bloodline had been compromised, that the next Duke or Duchess of Estries would carry merchant blood in their veins, would be only half what an Estries should be. Some families, old families, families with connections you cannot begin to comprehend, made it very clear that this was unacceptable. That if it were allowed to stand, this family would be cut off, marriages annulled, alliances severed, generations of careful work undone because of one impulsive marriage and the child it produced. So you decided," Gaius said slowly, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrible finality, "that the solution was to remove my daughter from existence entirely, not just from the line of succession, from life itself. I did what needed to be done," Calix said, and there was no apology in his voice, only a kind of grim, self-righteous certainty. "I protected this house. I protected 14 generations of legacy from being undone by one mistake." "You wanted my title," Gaius said, and now, finally, the gallery above caught its breath, because Albina, watching, listening, finally hearing the truth she had walked 11 miles in the rain to uncover, understood that the final piece was about to fall into place. "That's the truth beneath all of this, isn't it, Calix? It was never just about bloodlines or legacy or 14 generations of careful marriages. You didn't just want to remove an unsuitable heir. You wanted to ensure I would have no heir at all, so that everything, the title, the estate, the bloodline you claim to care so much about preserving, would eventually fall to you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servants, frozen at the edges of the room, seemed to be holding their breath. Calix's silence was its own confession, a silence that stretched on for 5 seconds, 10, 15, while his older brother stood before him and watched 11 years of carefully maintained brotherly affection collapse into something unrecognizable. From the gallery above, a small voice spoke, calm, clear, and utterly devastating in the stillness. "He tried to have me killed, didn't he?" Every head in the great hall turned. Albina stepped out from behind the pillar and into the light at the top of the staircase, small and steady, her dark curls catching the gray morning light from the high windows. And Gaius Caesar, for the first time in his life, by the look on his face, looked truly, genuinely afraid. Gaius just realized the street urchin he dismissed 30 seconds ago heard every word. If you think he's going to talk his way out of this, subscribe now, because what Albina says next is going to change the entire balance of power in that hall. You will not believe what happens. "Killed?" Gaius's voice cracked, the first genuine emotion he had shown since arriving, raw and unguarded in a way that surprised even Gaius. "No, I never ordered that. I ordered her removed, sent away, far from here, given to a family who would raise her as their own and never speak of where she came from. That was the arrangement. I never ordered anyone to. I am not a murderer, Gaius, whatever else you think of me." "And yet," Albina said, descending the staircase slowly, one careful step at a time, her composure seeming impossible for a child who had just learned that her own uncle had played some role in a plot against her life. "The woman who raised me, Trax, told me there was a second man, one who came to her cottage when I was 18 months old. He asked questions. He asked where the child was, whether anyone had come looking, whether the arrangement had held. Trax hid me in a grain barrel for 6 hours while he searched the cottage from top to bottom." Gaius's eyes snapped to his brother, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "You sent someone back for her. 18 months after you'd already had her sent away, you sent someone to check on her." Gaius's face had gone pale, the blood draining from it visibly. "Scipio. I sent Scipio, only to confirm she was being raised properly, to ensure the arrangement was holding, that no one had grown suspicious, that the family caring for her hadn't grown careless with the secret. Nothing more than that, Gaius, I swear it." "Scipio," Sophia Boyle said from the doorway, where she had quietly entered partway through Gaius's outburst, her voice cutting cleanly through the room, "was your father's former steward, the same man who, 18 years ago, confirmed that your father's first wife, Gaius's own mother, died of a sudden chill. A chill that was never investigated because Scipio controlled access to the household physician and ensured that physicians' reports never mentioned the unusual symptoms that preceded her death." The room went cold. "You're saying," Gaius said slowly, processing this new horror, "that Scipio has been disposing of inconvenient family members for 2 generations, that he killed Gaius's own mother." "I'm saying," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was revealing, that when Gaius sent Scipio to check on an 18-month-old child hidden away in a poor family's cottage, he was not sending a man to babysit. He was sending the same man who had, years earlier, quietly ensured the death of an inconvenient family member and called it natural causes. And Trax knew that, Gaius. Somehow, in whatever way information travels among people who have learned to survive by being careful, she knew exactly what kind of man Scipio was. That's why she hid an 18-month-old child in a grain barrel for 6 hours rather than risk a single word reaching that man's ears. Gaius had gone gray, his earlier bravado utterly stripped away. "I didn't know. I swear to you, Gaius, I told Scipio to check on her, to make sure the family was treating her well, nothing more than that." And yet a 6-month-old infant, an 18-month-old infant, nearly vanished, Gaius said, his voice rising for the first time. "And when Scipio came back with a vague report, you never questioned it. You never followed up. You never asked why the man you'd sent to check on a toddler had spent hours searching a cottage from top to bottom, terrifying the family hiding her. Tell me, brother, was that genuine ignorance or was it convenience? Was it easier for you to simply not ask questions because the answers might have implicated you in something you couldn't undo?" Calix had no answer. He stood frozen, his earlier arrogance entirely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. "Where is Scipio now?" Gaius asked Sophia, his voice cold and clipped. "He retired from service 4 years ago," Sophia said. "He lives on a small property near the southern border, a property I should mention that was gifted to him by Calix." All eyes in the great hall turned to the second son of Estries. "A retirement gift," Calix said weakly, the words clearly feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. For years of loyal service to this family. That's all. He served 3 generations. It seemed appropriate to... Or, Albina said, her child's voice somehow the steadiest voice in the entire room. Payment for services already rendered, and an understanding that more might be required if circumstances ever changed. Gaius looked at his brother, a man he had grown up beside, fought beside as boys, mourned beside when their father died, a man he had trusted with the management of half the estate's affairs for over a decade, and felt something inside him close, permanently, like a door being sealed shut. "Calix," he said quietly, and the quiet was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. "You will remain in this house under guard until the magistrate arrives from the capital. A full investigation will be opened into my daughter's disappearance and the conspiracy surrounding it, into your own mother's death 18 years ago, and into every gift, every payment, every transaction you have authorized to Scipio over the years, every detail. Nothing will be left unexamined. Gaius, please, we're brothers. We grew up in this house together. You cannot simply..." "You stopped being my brother," Gaius said, his voice hardening into something Albina, watching from the staircase, had never heard from him before. "The moment you ordered my infant daughter's death, and let me bury an empty casket and watch my wife waste away from grief for 8 years over a child you knew the entire time was alive somewhere. Whatever we were to each other before that, whatever childhood we shared, it ends here." He turned to the guards stationed at the hall's entrance, who had been listening to the entire exchange with growing horror. "Take Lord Calix to the east wing. Lock the door from the outside. No visitors, no correspondence, until the magistrate arrives and determines otherwise." As Calix was led away, still protesting, his voice growing increasingly desperate as the guard's hands closed firmly around his arms, Albina watched him go with an expression Gaius couldn't quite read. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't even satisfaction, though she had every right to feel either. It was something more complicated. Something that looked, if Gaius had to put a name to it, almost like grief. Grief for an uncle she had never known, for a family that had never existed the way it should have, for the family she might have had if 11 years of greed and fear hadn't poisoned everything before she was even born. When the doors closed behind Calix and the guards, the great hall fell into a heavy silence. "Amelia," Gaius said softly, crossing the hall toward her, using her real name, her birth name, for the first time since she had spoken it in the graveyard. She turned to him, and for a moment, the composed, careful child who had walked 11 miles in the rain and faced down a duke and his treacherous brother without flinching, looked suddenly very young indeed. "Thank you," Gaius said, kneeling before her, the same way he had knelt before her grave the night before. "For finding me, for telling the truth, even though it must have been terrifying, for trusting me when you had no reason to trust anyone in this family." "I didn't do it for thanks," Amelia said, her voice small now, the weight of everything that had happened over the past day finally catching up to her. "I did it because Trax told me, before she died, that somewhere out there I had a father who never stopped grieving for me. And I thought if that was true, even a little bit, he deserved to know I was alive. Even if it meant nothing else changed. Even if I had to leave again afterward." "You will never have to leave again," Gaius said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as long as I am alive. This is your home, Amelia. It has always been your home. It simply took 11 years for the truth to find its way back to where it belonged. And there, in the great hall of Estries Manor, surrounded by servants who had begun quietly to weep at the sight of it, in front of a stepmother whose own complicated guilt and grief mixed with something like hope, Duke Gaius Caesar wept for the first time in 8 years, not from grief, from relief, from a joy so overwhelming it felt, for a moment, indistinguishable from pain. The magistrate arrived 3 days later, a stern, methodical woman named Barbara Voss, known throughout the southern provinces for her incorruptibility and, more importantly, for her complete and total indifference to titles. She had built her reputation prosecuting noble families who believed their names placed them above the law, and she had never once, in 20 years of service, lost such a case. She arrived with a small retinue of clerks and investigators, and within hours of her arrival, Estries Manor had transformed from a household in shock into the site of a meticulous, methodical investigation. She interviewed Calix for 6 hours on the first day alone, a marathon session conducted in the same study where Scipio would later attempt to burn evidence, though no one yet knew that was coming. She interviewed Sophia twice, comparing her account against Calix's with the careful precision of someone assembling a puzzle. She interviewed the household staff, cooks, footmen, stable hands, anyone who had been employed at Estries 8 years prior and might remember anything unusual about the days surrounding the funeral. And finally, gently, carefully, she interviewed Amelia herself, though Gaius insisted on being present throughout, and Barbara agreed without argument, recognizing immediately that this was not a witness to be handled carelessly. By the end of the first day, 3 things had been established beyond any reasonable doubt. First, the physician who had signed Amelia's original death certificate 8 years ago, a man named Dr. Hollis Webb, had died of natural causes 2 years later, his role in the conspiracy seemingly lost with him. But his apprentice at the time, a young man named Dr. Felix Ashgrove, who had since become a respected physician in his own right, came forward voluntarily when news of the investigation reached him. He confirmed in a sworn statement that he had never examined the body of the supposed deceased child. He had been told by Dr. Webb that the child had died of fever during the night and had been given a death certificate already filled out to witness and sign. He had been paid, handsomely, far beyond what such a simple task should have warranted, and had been told in no uncertain terms that questions about the matter would not be welcomed. "I was young," Ashgrove told Barbara, his voice heavy with 8 years of unspoken guilt. "I needed the money. Dr. Webb was my mentor. I trusted him completely. It never occurred to me to question it. I have thought about that family every single year since, on the anniversary, wondering if I should have asked more questions. I am deeply sorry, Your Grace. I should have insisted on examining the child myself. I failed in my duty, and I have carried that failure for 8 years. You were deceived by men far more experienced in deception than you," Gaius told him, and meant it. "The failure was not yours. Second, and this was the moment that, Barbara would later say, transformed the investigation from a family dispute into a criminal matter of the highest order, the casket itself was exhumed. Under Barbara's direct order, with Gaius present, with Sophia present, with the entire household staff gathered at a respectful distance, the crypt was opened, and the small casket that had rested undisturbed for 8 years was brought into the gray afternoon light. Gaius had braced himself for this moment. He had told himself repeatedly over the past 3 days that he already knew what they would find, that he had already accepted the truth, that this was merely confirmation of something he had already processed. Nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The casket, when opened, contained not the remains of a child, but sandbags, ordinary sandbags, the kind used to weigh down tents or reinforce riverbanks, carefully wrapped and dressed in a small christening gown. 8 years of sandbags, sealed in a box, mourned as a daughter, visited annually with white roses by a father who had knelt beside them and wept. Gaius did not weep when they opened it. He had already done his weeping. In the study, 3 nights ago, when Albina had recited a letter from memory and a bracelet had confirmed everything. Instead, he simply turned to Calix, who had been brought to witness the exhumation under guard, his hands bound, his face ashen, and said nothing at all. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Calix opened his mouth as though to speak, to apologize perhaps, or to offer some final justification. But no words came. He simply stood there, looking at the sandbags dressed in his niece's christening gown, and the weight of what he had done seemed for the first time to truly register on his face. The silence was worse than any accusation could have been. Third, and most damning of all, a search of Calix's private study at his own estate, a search Barbara had ordered the moment the exhumation confirmed the conspiracy, uncovered a ledger, a small, leather-bound book kept in a locked drawer, documenting payments made over the past 8 years. Payments to Scipio, regular payments, quarterly, consistent, labeled in Calix's own handwriting with a phrase that, when Barbara read it aloud in the great hall before the assembled household, made even the most hardened servants gasp. For AC's continued silence, Barbara read, holding up the ledger for everyone to see. Quarterly payments for 8 years. AC, Lord Calix, does this refer to Amelia Caesar? Calix said nothing. He had said almost nothing since the exhumation, his earlier defiance entirely extinguished, replaced by a kind of hollow, defeated silence. This is not a retirement gift, Barbara continued, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. This is 8 years of systematic hush money paid to a man with a documented history, now confirmed thanks to testimony gathered in this investigation, of making inconvenient family members disappear permanently and calling it natural causes. 8 years of payments to ensure that a child, an innocent child, hidden away in poverty through no fault of her own, never resurfaced to threaten your inheritance. Lord Calix, this is no longer merely a matter of inheritance disputes or family scandal. This is conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit infanticide, and, pending the results of our investigation into your mother's death, potentially conspiracy to commit murder as well. I never wanted her dead, Calix said, and for the first time, his voice broke completely, cracking into something raw and desperate. I wanted her gone. I told myself that was different. I told myself... He stopped, his composure finally, completely shattering. I told myself I was being merciful, that sending her away to be raised by strangers in poverty, with no knowledge of who she was, that this was kinder than the alternative. I told myself that for 8 years, Barbara, every single time I made one of those payments, I told myself I had chosen mercy. Mercy, Barbara said coldly, her voice cutting through his words like a blade, is not something you get to define for other people, Lord Calix, especially not for an infant who never did anything to you except exist. You did not choose mercy. You chose the option that allowed you to sleep at night while still benefiting from a crime. There is a difference, and I think somewhere beneath 8 years of self-justification, you have always known it. Calix had no response to that. He simply stood, hands bound, surrounded by the ruins of his own carefully constructed life, and said nothing at all. Barbara turned to Gaius. Your Grace, I'll need to send a unit south to Scipio's property immediately. If word of these proceedings reaches him before we arrive, if he learns that Lord Calix has been detained, that the ledger has been discovered, that the child has resurfaced, he'll run, Gaius finished grimly. Or he'll destroy evidence, or both. Or, Albina said quietly from the corner of the great hall, where she had been sitting throughout the entire proceedings with the unnerving patience of a child who had spent her whole life learning how to be still and listen without being noticed. He'll come here. Every adult in the room turned to look at her. Why would he come here? Barbara asked, though there was no skepticism in her voice, only genuine curiosity. The curiosity of someone who had learned, over the past 3 days, that this particular child's instincts were rarely wrong. Because if Calix is arrested, Albina said, and the ledger is found, and the investigation into his mother's death begins, Scipio is the only person left who knows the full truth of everything. 2 generations of secrets, all connected to him. Men like that don't wait around to be caught, magistrate. They don't run either. Running just means living the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for someone to find you. Men like that tie up loose ends. That's what Trax always said. They make sure there's nothing left that can hurt them. Loose ends, Gaius repeated slowly, the implications settling over him like a physical weight. Like a witness who can place him at Trax's cottage 8 years ago. Like a witness who can confirm he was sent there specifically to find a hidden child. Like me, Albina said simply, without any apparent fear, though Gaius felt his blood run cold at the calm way she said it. Barbara Voss's expression hardened immediately, all traces of the earlier interrogation falling away, replaced by something sharp and focused. Your Grace, I recommend doubling the guard on this house immediately. Tonight, before nightfall. If this man has spent 2 generations cleaning up problems for this family quietly, methodically, and without ever once being caught or even suspected, he is not the kind of man who waits for a magistrate's summons to arrive at his door. If he has any network of informants left, any contacts among Calix's staff, any way of learning what has happened here over the past 3 days, he may already know. She turned to her own people, issuing rapid instructions. Riders to be sent south immediately to apprehend Scipio at his property, additional guards to be summoned from the nearest garrison, the household's doors and windows to be checked and secured before nightfall. But even as preparations began, even as guards doubled and doors were barred, and the household settled into an uneasy, watchful silence as evening fell, there was an unspoken understanding in the air, an understanding that Albina, more than anyone, seemed to grasp with chilling clarity. If Scipio had any way of learning what had transpired at Estries Manor over the past 3 days, he would not wait for morning. The guards doubled. The great doors were barred from the inside, heavy iron bolts drawn across oak that had stood for 200 years. Windows on the ground floor were checked and secured, shutters latched, and additional men stationed at every entrance to the manor grounds. Gaius insisted Amelia sleep in the room adjoining his own, the nursery, the very room he had locked for 8 years, never once opening it, never once allowing anyone to enter, preserving it as a kind of shrine to a grief he had believed permanent. Now, in a single afternoon, that room was hastily aired, dusted, furnished with fresh linens, and prepared for the daughter who had, 8 years late, finally come home to it. Amelia stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long time before entering, looking at the small bed, the faded toys still arranged on shelves exactly as they had been left, the painted mural of stars on the ceiling that Cassia had commissioned before her daughter was even born. "This was mine?" she asked quietly. "All of this?" "All of it," Gaius confirmed, standing beside her in the doorway, his voice gentle. "Your mother painted those stars herself, before you were born. She used to say she wanted you to fall asleep every night feeling like you were sleeping under the open sky, even in winter." Amelia stepped into the room slowly, reaching out to touch one of the small wooden toys on the shelf, a carved horse, its paint faded but still recognizable. "I don't remember any of this," she said softly. "I don't remember her. I don't remember any of it." "You were 2 years old," Gaius said. "It isn't surprising that you don't remember. But Amelia, there will be time. So much time now for you to learn about your mother, about this house, about everything that was taken from you. We have the rest of our lives for that." She slept poorly that night, despite the exhaustion of the past 3 days, despite the soft bed and the familiar comfort of the room that had once been hers. So did Gaius, in the chamber adjoining hers, lying awake and listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in the room next door, a sound he had not heard in 8 years, a sound that filled him with a fierce, protective joy he had almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. It was past midnight when Gaius woke to the sound of glass breaking, not loud, not the crash of a window shattered carelessly, but precise, controlled. A single pane, somewhere on the ground floor, broken with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how to minimize the sound. He was on his feet instantly, every sense suddenly sharp, the exhaustion of the past 3 days burning away in an instant of pure adrenaline. He crossed to the cabinet in the corner of his room and withdrew the ceremonial sword that had hung there, unused, since his father's funeral 11 years ago. A blade kept sharp out of habit and tradition rather than any expectation of necessity, until tonight. He moved to the door connecting his chamber to the nursery and found Amelia already awake, sitting upright in bed, perfectly still, her dark eyes wide in the dim light of the single candle she had insisted on keeping lit. "He's here," she whispered. "Isn't he?" "Stay in this room," Gaius said, his voice low and urgent. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone except me, and if I do not return within a few minutes, go to the window and signal the guards stationed in the garden. Do you understand?" "Your Grace." Her voice stopped him at the threshold, steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "He'll go for the study first, the ledger. Calix's ledger. He'll think if he can destroy any remaining copies, any remaining evidence connecting him to Scipio, there's no proof left of his own involvement. He'll think that's the priority." "The ledger Barbara found has already been taken to the capital," Gaius said. "It's in the magistrate's possession, under guard. Burning anything here changes nothing." "He doesn't know that," Amelia said. "He doesn't know what's already been found or what's already been moved. He only knows that Calix has been arrested if word reached him at all, and even that he might not know for certain. He'll assume the worst, and he'll try to destroy whatever he can reach. Men like that, Trax used to say, they always go for the paper first. They think paper is the only thing that can hurt them. They forget that people remember things too. People are harder to burn." Gaius stared at her for a long moment, at this 9-year-old girl who somehow, through some combination of inherited instinct and a childhood spent learning to survive by understanding the men who might come looking for her, had just outlined Scipio's likely plan with chilling accuracy. "Bar the door," he said finally. "I will return." He descended the staircase alone, moving with the careful silence of a man who had grown up in this house and knew every creaking floorboard, every shadow, every place where light from the hallway sconces failed to reach. The great hall was dark and empty, the dining room the same. But as he approached the study, his own study, where 3 nights ago he had sat with Amelia and heard, for the first time, the full truth of what had been taken from him, he saw light. Not the warm glow of a lit lamp left burning, but the flickering orange light of an open flame, visible beneath the closed study door. Gaius pushed the door open slowly, sword raised, and found Scipio kneeling at the cold fireplace, now considerably less cold, feeding pages of a small, leather-bound book into the flames with the unhurried, methodical movements of a man performing a familiar task. Scipio was older than Gaius remembered from childhood, thin, gray, with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent a lifetime believing himself untouchable, operating in the shadows of a great family for so long that he had perhaps forgotten what it felt like to be observed, to be vulnerable, to be caught. "You're too late," Gaius said from the doorway, his voice carrying clearly across the study. "The first ledger is already with the magistrate, 3 days' ride from here, under armed guard. Burning whatever that is changes nothing about what's already been discovered." Scipio did not startle. He did not even turn quickly. He simply finished feeding the page he was holding into the fire, watched it curl and blacken for a moment, and then turned to face Gaius with the unhurried calm of a man greeting an acquaintance at a dinner party rather than a duke who had caught him committing a crime in the dead of night. "Your Grace," Scipio said pleasantly, rising slowly to his feet, brushing ash from the knees of his trousers. "I confess, I was hoping to avoid this particular conversation. I had hoped to be finished and gone before anyone woke." 18 years ago, Gaius said, stepping fully into the study, sword held steady, his eyes never leaving Scipio's face. "You poisoned my father's first wife, Calix's mother, and called it a chill, and no one ever questioned it because you controlled every report that reached anyone who might have asked questions. 8 years ago, you were paid by my brother to ensure my infant daughter disappeared permanently, and instead, out of whatever remained of a conscience, or perhaps simply out of some calculation I do not fully understand, you let her be hidden rather than killed. And 18 months after that, you went looking for her again to finish the job you had been originally hired to do. That's a very dramatic summary, Scipio said, his thin smile never wavering. Though not, I admit, entirely inaccurate. You have clearly had a very informative few days, Your Grace. Why? Gaius's grip tightened on the sword, his voice cracking despite his efforts to remain controlled. Why come back for an 18-month-old child, Scipio? What possible threat could an infant pose to you that you would search a cottage from top to bottom looking for her? Scipio's smile faded slightly, not into guilt, Gaius noted with a chill, but into something closer to weary irritation, as though he found the question tedious. Because Lord Calix panicked, Scipio said, with the air of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. He decided, 18 months after the original arrangement, that the situation was too risky. Too many people who knew the child's location, too many opportunities for word to spread, too many years ahead in which the secret might unravel. He wanted it cleaner, more permanent. He came to me directly, told me the original arrangement needed to be corrected. And you went, Gaius said. I went, Scipio confirmed. With instructions I had no genuine intention of carrying out fully, Your Grace. I am many things. I will not pretend otherwise to a man who has clearly learned a great deal about my history in the past few days. But I have always drawn certain lines. Even 18 years ago with Calix's mother, that was a matter of removing an obstacle to an inheritance, an adult who understood on some level the games being played around her. An infant is different. So I went to that cottage, and I searched, and I made a great deal of noise about searching, and I allowed the woman hiding the child, your tracks, every opportunity to hide her successfully before I found anything. And then I reported back to Lord Calix that the trail had gone cold, that the family who had taken the child seemed to have moved on or disappeared themselves, and that further investigation would likely prove fruitless. You lied to him, Gaius said slowly. You let him believe the search had failed naturally, when in reality, you had deliberately allowed it to fail. I have been managing this family's messes for 2 generations, Duke, Scipio said, and for the first time, something bitter crept into his voice, something that sounded, disturbingly, like genuine resentment. I have cleaned up after men too cowardly to do their own killing, too squeamish to handle the consequences of their own decisions, for 30 years. I have grown very tired of it. And tonight? Gaius asked, his voice hardening. What were you planning to do tonight, Scipio? You came here in the dead of night, broke a window, came directly to this study. What was your plan? Scipio's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward the ceiling, toward the floor above, where Emilia slept behind a barred door, and Gaius felt every muscle in his body go rigid with sudden, cold understanding. Tonight, Scipio said softly, his voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost kind, which made it infinitely more horrifying. I came to finally finish what I should have finished 8 years ago. Cleanly. Quietly. No more loose ends, no more ledgers, no more 30-year-old secrets unraveling because of one child who refused to stay hidden. The girl disappears. Tonight, quietly, in a manner that will look to anyone who investigates like nothing more than a tragic accident, a child wandering somewhere she shouldn't have in the dark and falling, perhaps, into the river that runs along the eastern boundary of this estate. The scandal dies with her. This family's name remains untarnished for at least 1 more generation. I would have done you a mercy, Your Grace, though I doubt you'll see it that way. Better a quiet ending now than years of public disgrace, trials, scandal. Your family's name dragged through every gossip column in the capital for a decade. I have seen what that does to families. I was trying, in my own way, to spare you that. The room went very still. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them, Gaius was acutely aware his daughter lay awake behind a barred door, trusting that her father had gone to face whatever threat had entered their home and would return to her safely. You came, Gaius said, his voice dropping to something dangerously soft, every word deliberate. Into my house, in the dead of night, to kill my daughter. Again. And you are standing here, telling me this to my face, calling it mercy. I came, Scipio corrected, with the calm, infuriating precision of a man who genuinely believed himself reasonable, to clean up a mess that was never mine to begin with. A mess created by your brother's ambition, your father's obsession with bloodline purity, and, forgive me, Your Grace, but you did ask for honesty, your own decision 11 years ago to marry a woman whose existence in this family was never going to be accepted by the people who actually hold power in this kingdom. I am simply the man who has spent 30 years cleaning up after everyone else's choices. I take no pleasure in any of it. But someone has always had to do it, and it has always, somehow, fallen to me. Gaius raised the sword, not yet to strike, but in clear warning, positioning his body fully between Scipio and the study door, between Scipio and the staircase that led up to where his daughter waited. You will not take one step toward those stairs, Gaius said, his voice no longer soft at all. Not one. You will surrender now, Scipio, and face whatever judgment the magistrate determines, or you will not leave this room at all. Those are the only two outcomes available to you tonight. Scipio studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then, slowly, his hand moved toward his coat, toward something concealed beneath it, something Gaius had not seen until that moment, something that caught the firelight with a dull, metallic gleam. And Gaius lunged. The fight was brief, brutal, and almost entirely silent, the kind of violence that happens too fast for shouting, too desperate for anything but instinct. Scipio was old, but he was not weak, and decades of managing messes for a powerful family had left him with skills Gaius had not anticipated from a man who, until tonight, he had known only as a name in old household records. A blade flashed from beneath Scipio's coat, a thin, wickedly sharp dagger, the kind designed for exactly the sort of quiet, efficient work Scipio had spent his life performing, and Gaius felt its edge graze his forearm as he twisted away, the ceremonial sword clattering against the heavy oak desk as the two men collided. They grappled across the study, knocking over a chair, scattering papers that Scipio had not yet managed to burn, the fire in the grate throwing wild, shifting shadows across the walls. Gaius was younger, stronger, but Scipio fought with the cold, economical efficiency of a man who had never relied on strength, who had always relied on precision, on knowing exactly where to strike to end a confrontation quickly. Gaius felt the dagger's edge catch his shoulder, a line of fire across his skin, and stumbled back against the desk, momentarily losing his footing. But Scipio had made one critical miscalculation, a miscalculation born of 30 years of operating in the shadows, of never once being seen, never once being caught, never once having to account for the possibility that someone might act against him before he could act first. He had assumed the household was asleep. He had assumed that a single broken window pane, in a house this size, in the dead of night, would go unnoticed long enough for him to complete his task and vanish back into the darkness from which he'd come. He had not accounted for Amelia. The moment Gaius had left her room, instructing her to bar the door and remain hidden, Amelia had not done either of those things. She had waited only long enough to be certain her father had reached the bottom of the stairs, and then she had slipped out of the nursery, not toward danger, but toward the east wing where two guards stood watch over a locked door containing Gaius Caesar, the nearest armed men in the entire manor. "He's here," she had told them, breathless from running, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. "The man Gaius paid. Scipio. He's in the Duke's study. He has a knife. He's going to hurt the Duke, and then he's coming for me. Please, you have to hurry." The guards, trained men who had spent the past 3 days hearing increasingly alarming details about the conspiracy unfolding around them, did not hesitate for even a second. They abandoned their post outside Gaius's locked door, a calculated risk, but the right one, and ran, with Amelia leading the way through corridors she had only walked through once, but somehow, in her urgency, navigated without a single wrong turn. By the time Scipio had Gaius pinned against the desk, the dagger raised for what would have been a final fatal strike, the study doors burst open and 4 armed guards flooded the room, moving with the speed and coordination of men who had spent 3 days bracing for exactly this moment. Scipio was disarmed in seconds, the dagger knocked from his hand, skittering across the floor and coming to rest against the leg of a bookshelf. He was restrained in less time still, 2 guards forcing his arms behind his back while a third retrieved the dagger and the 4th moved immediately to check on Gaius, who was breathing hard, blood seeping from the cut on his shoulder and the shallower wound on his forearm, but alive, whole, safe. Gaius, leaning heavily against the desk, looked up, past the guards, past Scipio's furious, thwarted expression, and found Emilia standing in the doorway of the study. She was not frightened, though Gaius could see in the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides that the fear was there, held carefully in check. She was not triumphant either, though she had every right to be. She had just, by acting decisively and without hesitation, almost certainly saved her father's life. Instead, she simply looked present, the same quiet, steady presence she had shown at every turning point of this story, from the moment she had whispered 5 words over a grave to this moment, standing in a fire-lit study, watching the man who had twice tried to end her life being dragged away in chains. "You came back down," Gaius said, his voice rough with exertion and emotion both. "I told you to stay hidden, to bar the door." "I know," Emilia said simply, "but I told you, Your Grace, I didn't do any of this for thanks, and I'm not going to start being someone who hides when the people I care about are in danger. I did this because someone needed to know the truth, and someone needed to be safe. Both of those someones were you. I wasn't going to let that man take that away from us, not after everything it took to get here." Gaius pushed himself away from the desk, ignoring the protests of the guard checking his wounds, and crossed the room to kneel before his daughter, not for the first time in 3 days, but somehow, this time, it felt different. This time it felt like the final piece of something settling into place. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You're my father," Emilia said, as though this were simply the most obvious explanation in the world, requiring no further elaboration. That's what family does. In the weeks that followed, the truth of House Estries became public, not through scandal or rumor, but through Barbara Voss's meticulous, methodical, and utterly undeniable investigation, which left no detail unexamined and no question unanswered. Gaius Caesar was stripped of his titles, his lands, and his place in the Estries line of succession entirely. He was convicted of conspiracy to commit infanticide, fraud, and obstruction, though notably not of his mother's death, which the investigation determined had been Scipio's act alone, carried out without Gaius's knowledge or involvement, 18 years before Gaius had ever thought to make use of Scipio's particular skills. He was sentenced to permanent exile from the kingdom, a fate that, surprisingly, Gaius himself argued for over Barbara's initial recommendation of a far harsher punishment. "He is still my brother," Gaius told Barbara privately in the days before sentencing. "What he did was monstrous. I will never pretend otherwise, and I will never forgive it. Not fully, not ever. But I will not have his blood on my hands or on this family's name, on top of everything else. Let him live, somewhere far from here, with whatever conscience he has left. That is its own punishment, I think, more lasting than anything a court could impose." Gaius left Estries in disgrace, under armed escort, and was never seen within the kingdom's borders again. What became of him afterward, no one at Estries ever learned, and, as the years passed, no one much cared to find out. Scipio received no such mercy. The full weight of 2 generations of crimes, a poisoning disguised as natural death, a conspiracy to murder an infant, and a second, nearly successful attempt on that same child's life 9 years later, left the courts with little room and even less inclination for leniency. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the capital's most secure facility, a sentence he received with the same eerie, unbothered calm with which he had described his plans to Gaius in the study. His name was struck from every record of loyal service the Estries family had ever kept, and the property Calix had gifted him was seized and sold, the proceeds donated, at Gaius's insistence, to a foundation established to support families displaced by exactly the kind of conspiracy that had torn his own family apart. Sophia Boyle's role in the affair proved the most complicated to resolve. For her quiet act of mercy 8 years prior, diverting an order to kill into an order to hide, at considerable personal risk to herself, she was neither punished nor celebrated. Barbara Voss, after extensive deliberation, declined to bring any charges against her, noting in her final report that, without Lady Boyle's intervention, however incomplete, however delayed in its full disclosure, the child in question would, in all likelihood, not be alive today to provide testimony at all. Sophia remained at Estries, though something between her and Gaius had shifted permanently, not quite forgiveness, not quite resentment, but something more complicated than either. An understanding, perhaps, between two people who had both, in their own deeply flawed and imperfect ways, tried to do right within a situation that offered no good options at all. Emilia, for her part, never fully warmed to Sophia, a wariness that Gaius understood and never pushed his daughter to overcome, but neither did she treat the older woman with hostility. There was, between them, a kind of careful peace, built slowly over years, that both seemed to find sufficient. And Emilia Caesar, formerly Albina, raised in poverty by a woman named Trax in a cottage that no longer existed, hidden for 9 years from a world that had once tried to ensure she would never exist at all, was formally recognized before the royal court as the rightful heir to the dukedom of Estries. The recognition ceremony was, by the standards of such things, relatively small and quiet. Gaius had insisted on that, unwilling to turn his daughter's restoration into a spectacle. But word of the case had spread regardless, and the story of the Duke of Estries and his daughter, returned from the dead 9 years after a funeral that had never held a body, became, for a time, one of the most talked-about events in the kingdom. The locket, repaired, its chain restrung after the damage of that night in the study, now hung permanently around Emilia's neck. The tiny painted portrait inside, of a laughing 2-year-old in a blue dress, sat alongside a small space Gaius had commissioned a new portrait to fill, Emilia at 9, in the same locket beside the child she had been before everything was taken from her. A reminder, he told her, not of what had been lost, but of everything that had, against every possible odd, been found again. On the anniversary of her death, the same date, the same graveyard, the same white roses, 6 of them, just as always, Gaius and Emilia visited the grave together one final time. This time they did not come to mourn. They came to remove the headstone. "What should we do with it?" Emilia asked, standing beside her father, watching as workers carefully lifted the heavy marble slab that had marked an empty grave for 8 years, a grave that had never held what it claimed to hold, that had been visited and wept over and tended with white roses for a child who had been alive the entire time, 11 miles away. Gaius considered this for a long moment, watching the marble emerge from the earth, rain-darkened and weathered from years of weather and grief. "We'll keep it," he said finally. "Not buried, displayed, somewhere in the manor, perhaps near the family records, where anyone who asks about the history of this family will see it and be told the truth of what it represents. So that no one in this family, for as long as the Estries name endures, ever forgets what almost happened here, what it cost and what it took to make it right." Emilia slipped her small hand into his, and together, father and daughter, reunited against odds that had once seemed insurmountable, they walked away from the grave that had never truly held her, toward a home that, for the first time in 8 years, finally felt whole. Behind them, the white roses remained where they had been placed that morning, not in mourning this time, but in celebration. 6 roses, for 6 years Cassia had not lived to see this day. A small, quiet tribute to the woman who had died believing her daughter was lost forever, never knowing that the truth, The whole impossible, miraculous truth had been waiting all along, 11 miles away, in the careful keeping of a woman named Trax, and in the steady, unshakable courage of a little girl who had walked through the rain to make sure the truth was finally told. The end. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens when you try to fake a child's death and hope nobody checks the casket for 8 years. Spoiler, someone always checks the casket. If you enjoyed watching an entire noble family implode because one guy couldn't handle having a niece, smash that subscribe button. Because we've got way more Dukes about to drop way more Lockets, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one.